All of humanity should gather as one man.
Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you could be here tonight. Thanks also to those of you who are joining our live stream and joining us virtually. My name is Kim Jones. I'm the Vice Dean for Academic Affairs for the College of Humanities. I'm standing in tonight for our Dean, A.P. Durand. He loves to be here. He would be here tonight, except that he's in Kazakhstan. So I'm not sure he's even here virtually because it may still be an hour that he's sleeping over there. So we'd like to start today by saying that we respectfully acknowledge that the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to develop sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and indigenous communities through education offerings, outreach, and community service. So we also want to acknowledge that this land acknowledgement, which is relatively new, is a milestone in our ongoing dialogue with the Tohono O'odham, the Pascua Yaqui, and the other 20 federally recognized tribes in the state. It is an indicator of our commitment to collaboration and to maintaining government-to-government relationships with the Native nations and indigenous communities with whom we share this region. Thank you so much again for joining us at the 12th Annual Tucson Humanities Festival. We started actually as Humanities Week quite a few years ago, but now through community outreach, engagement, and the incredible speakers that we're able to bring, we've grown into a month-long series of thought-provoking presentations during October each year. We celebrate it during October because that's National Arts and Humanities Month. The theme, as you saw for this year's festival, is storytelling. I want especially to thank our sponsors who helped make tonight's event and the festival possible: Arizona Humanities, the Dorrance Family Foundation, the Humanities Seminars Program, and Bookman's Entertainment Exchange. And we're excited, as I said, we have people joining us live stream. We're offering tonight's presentation to a wide audience at home through live stream and captioning that's provided by the town of Oro Valley. For those of you who are watching live here in person tonight, if you're on live stream, you can find the link on the Humanities Festival page to ask questions for the Q&A. Feel free to put those in at any time. For those of you who are attending live in person here, there are QR codes. You can see them on these. I'm not sure how far a phone will focus on that to get the QR code, but if you get the QR code, you can then submit questions. Because of COVID protocols, we won't be passing a microphone around for the Q&A. Tonight, we are going to have the pleasure of listening to Renee Tajima-Peña. She's going to be introduced by Ivy Banks. Dr. Banks is our Associate Vice Provost of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. She joined the University of Arizona from Northern Arizona University, where she served as Assistant Vice President of Student Affairs for Engagement and Inclusive Excellence. In this capacity, she led initiatives to unify academic and student affair engagements through targeted messaging, predictive analytics systems, and aligning efforts to enhance support around first-generation first-year students of color. And among other things, I think it's very telling that she implemented the Inclusion and Diversity Scholars Program, and in the course of a single year, she expanded freshman diversity mentoring from 30 diverse students to 650. So we consider ourselves really lucky to have lured her down here from Flagstaff. So Dr. Banks, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. I am so excited to be here tonight and to introduce our speaker. And as I was thinking about the theme of tonight and beginning to share, I began to think about a story about diversity and inclusion in this work. And I remember when I started in this work, I was talking to a colleague, and they kind of responded in their tone and their body language as if they were mocking my storytelling in diversity and inclusion. So I questioned it. Are you mocking my storytelling in diversity and inclusion? And they said something to the effect that, oh, I gave up storytelling in kindergarten and good luck with your scholarly pursuits in that area. After thinking for a moment, I shared with that person that yes, I did learn storytelling when I was quite young. At an early age, I learned my alphabet, I learned my number system, and I shared that just like my ABCs and my 1, 2, 3s, storytelling then and now was the fundamental block, or one of the fundamental building blocks of my humanity. And just like I still use the lessons of Brer Rabbit that my grandfather shared with me in my diversity and inclusion programming, it's important that we understand that in the theme of storytelling, that's how we learn to get comfortable being uncomfortable, and we learn to see through the eyes of another. And when we talk about harnessing the power of diversity and inclusion here at the University of Arizona, it is through storytelling that we can make that happen. Because it's in these elements, those fundamental building blocks, just like my 1, 2, 3s and my ABCs, that in storytelling, I learned the power of diversity, inclusive excellence, and how in each other is how we can bring forth a new reality in what we see every day. And I am so pleased to be able to introduce our newest storyteller. And I was able to see her at Northern Arizona University. And then also last year, watching several actually online virtual presentations. So I'm very pleased to introduce to you today Renee Tajima-Peña for her talk on her PBS documentary series, Asian Americans. Renee is an Academy Award nominated filmmaker whose work focuses on immigrant communities, race, gender, and social justice. She has become a chronicler of the American scene with her documentary films, Who Killed Vincent Chin?, the acclaimed investigation into the beating death of a Chinese American in Detroit, and also My America, or Hunk If You Love Buddha, a feature-length road documentary in search of Asian America, where she encounters rappers, debutantes, laborers, and freedom fighters. Renee's work has screened at worldwide film festivals and venues such as Cannes, Hawaii, Hong Kong, London, New Directors, New Films, Sundance, and the Whitney Biennial. She is a 2011 Guggenheim Fellow and has been awarded a USA Broad Fellowship and the Alpert Award of the Arts. She is a recipient of 24 other film awards and honors, including a Golden Gate Award for Best Television Documentary at the San Francisco International Film Festival for Calverde Highway. She is currently a professor of Asian American Studies at UCLA, where she is the director of the Center for Ethno-Communications and holds an endowed chair in Japanese American Studies. She was founding faculty and graduate director of the graduate program in social documentation at UC Santa Cruz. As a reminder for those that are watching live, if you have questions you would like to ask Renee, please find the link on the Humanities Festival page. For those of you attending in person, Please use the QR codes, which you can see posted around the room in the seating area, to submit questions. In deference to COVID safety, we will not be passing a microphone during the Q&A. Now, please join me in a warm Wildcat welcome for Renee Tajima-Peña.
Thanks so much. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you, everybody. You've been treating me so well. I had my swag bag and my drink and my QR codes. I'm in great shape. I better time myself because I start to ramble sometimes. So if I start to ramble, just yell from the back, bleacher seats. Shut up! Get to the Q&A. I'm going to talk today about history as our story and weave it in with the journey I took and we all took in the production of the Asian American series. And I want to talk about our story / history, why it matters and what I learned about why it matters as I was making Asian Americans. Because today as Americans, we're really embroiled in this war over the narrative, over the story. Who gets to tell the story and who gets to define who we are as Americans. Because the narrative tells us not only who we are, but who's in and who's out, who's we and who's they. And so the attack on history, it's called the attack on critical race theory, but it really is an attack on inclusive history. And to me, that attack is, it's justified by saying that, if you tell these stories from the past, these challenges of systemic racism from the past, then it's divisive. But I would argue that ultimately it brings us together. Because when we know the truth, when we know our truth, and a part of that truth is not only the conflict, it's not only the bad stuff. A part of that truth is all of our resistance, our resilience, and the way we've come together to really move forward towards a more perfect union. That's a huge part of that story, and we lose that part of the story unless we tell this history. And I think I realized through my own kind of journey of being very young and feeling actually very alienated from this country because my story wasn't being told. But in my journey to really reclaim my own history, I started to realize what my role is in shaping this more perfect union, what my role is in advancing the democracy and in advancing the American project. So I go back to my childhood. And I'm third generation Japanese American. My family, I grew up, unlike a lot of Japanese Americans whose families never talked about their experiences during World War II, when 110,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated in concentration camps because they were both foreign-born immigrants and US citizens who were born here. And, but my family always talked about it, and their friends always talked about it. And if we met another Japanese American family, the first thing my parents would ask is, what camp were you in? Now, can you see? Okay, so this is Heart Mountain, Wyoming. This is my mother on the far right with her parents and several of her brothers. And she grew up in Los Angeles. They were first put in the Santa Anita racetrack in the horse stalls to be detained there for, I think, about 6 months. And then they were shipped out to Heart Mountain, Wyoming. This is my father's parents, my grandfather, who always wore I wonder if he ever put on like jeans or a bathing suit or something. I mean, he was always in a three-piece suit. He was a pastor, a Presbyterian pastor. And this is Gila River, the camp at Gila River, which I think is just north of here. That's where my father's parents were incarcerated. And this is my uncle Tennille, who was in the US Army. So while they were incarcerated, as soon as Japanese American, the Nisei, the American-born Nisei, my father's generation, as soon as they were accepted into the US Army, the sons were drafted. My father and two of his brothers were drafted and served. And my father used to say that he would visit his sister, because he has a sister at Heart Mountain, or visit his parents, and he would say, the one thing is the guards with the guns were always pointing the guns inside the camp, not outside the camp. And he couldn't make that connection, because inside the camp were his parents, his friends, his sister, and that's who the guards were protecting the rest of America against them. So when I was, I grew up with these stories, and when I was in the 6th grade, I grew up around Los Angeles, California. I was in Mrs. Count's 6th grade class, and we were assigned a oral report. We were supposed to interview somebody, do an oral report on something. So I interviewed my mother and my grandmother about their World War II experiences. And then I came up, like this in front of the class, and I started telling their story of going to Santa Anita, being evacuated, being incarcerated for 3 years behind barbed wire. And then from the back of the class, I could hear Mrs. Count screaming, "What are you talking about? That can never happen in America." And I said, I was 10, I said, "But Mommy told me this, and Grandma told me this." And she said, "Well, they're lying. They're lying. It's fabricated. You fabricated the whole thing." And I was, if you know Leela Lee, who's a cartoonist, has this meme or cartoon, angry little Asian girl, she's like flipping the bird. That was me at 10. I was always like a really oppositional child. But I think at that moment, I really realized, well, my history is dangerous, to some people at least. And the truth is valuable, and we have to fight to tell our story. And I think that's the day I became a filmmaker. So if you just fast forward many, many years, I did become a filmmaker. And many, many more years, I became the series producer of The Asian Americans, a 5-part series on PBS. And as we were producing the series, and particularly as we broadcast it in May of 2020, the United States was really at an inflection point. The US has become more diverse, vastly more diverse, yet more divided. So one of the starting points for me as the showrunner of the series was really, how do we understand our past to understand our current moment? And how does our past help us understand how we move forward together to cross these divisions? So what the strategy we really took is, it's very similar in a way to the 1619 project, Nicole Hannah-Jones's project, where she returned to 1619, to slavery, and she looked at how, and all the writers looked at how that legacy of slavery shaped America in a large sense, and shaped the lives of African Americans up to this day. And so we look back to our origin story as Asian Americans to when we first began to arrive in significant numbers as immigrants in the mid-1800s, late 1800s, and I would say, and we went all the way to past 9/11, 2001. But for me, the really interesting period in that early time was the period of the late 1800s, early 1900s, after the Civil War and after Reconstruction. Because again, this was a time, an inflection point in the United States. The United States was becoming, demographically vastly diverse, just like today. So in the United States, the US body politic was expanded but with freed black people, formerly enslaved black people, Chinese immigrants followed by other Asian immigrants. The US had taken tribal lands, parts of Mexico, and the US empire was colonizing people in the Atlantic and the Pacific. Puerto Rico, Philippines, which was a huge country. Millions of people were living in the Philippines. Hawaii, Guam, etc. So all of a sudden you have all these new non-white people in the body politic. And Americans were faced with this question, well, now what do we do with them? Are they Americans like us? Are they going to vote? Are they going to marry our women? Are their children going to go to school with our children? And the answer was really, no, So you see the rise of Jim Crow laws targeted towards African Americans. You see anti-Asian exclusion. In 1882, for the first time in this country, a whole group of people were banned from entering the US based on race, the Chinese Exclusion Act, followed by a series of exclusionary policies directed towards Asians. And this is something that we really realized as a group of filmmakers, mostly Asian American filmmakers, as we were making the series. So much of these stories of this context and these times were, spoke to our own family stories. And for me, it really spoke to my family story because my grandparents first arrived here during exclusion from the early 1900s. This is my mother's father, Grandpa Ujie, and he first immigrated from Japan to Hawaii in 1902 to cut cane on sugar plantations in Hawaii. And then, of course, he had a lot of people Asian migrant workers were brought in because indigenous people had been decimated before that time, so there was this huge need for labor. There's also, with the United States, the nation building and the growing economy in the mainland, there was this huge need for labor. It was attracting mostly European immigrants, but it was attracting also immigrants from Asia. In 1906, we don't know why, but Grandpa decided he would leave Hawaii and take a ship and go to San Francisco and try his luck in San Francisco. And in April of 1906, he landed in the port of San Francisco, and as soon as he stepped off the boat, these racist thugs, went after him with rocks, and you're telling him to go back to China. He didn't quite, get that, but they attacked him. And an interesting thing is, one of the stories we told in the series that we researched for the series of a family, the Tape family. They were a Chinese-American family, immigrant family in San Francisco in the late 1800s. And Joseph Tape was this entrepreneur, and he had this business transporting Chinese immigrants. So when they arrived on these boats in the port, like my grandfather did, they would take them into Chinatown where they can live and work. But they always knew where the racist thugs were. They would often be up on a bridge or something and waiting for the Chinese immigrants so they can throw rocks at them and attack them. And it was like Waze or Google Maps, because they would have these warnings, well, they're at this bridge, so you've got to take another route. And I realized, well, my grandfather, he didn't quite have that experience because he immediately left for Los Angeles. He wasn't going to stick around. He knew that this was bad news. As it turns out, the next day was the San Francisco earthquake. So thank God those racist thugs. I mean, that's why I'm here today. But so Grandpa eventually married a picture bride, my grandmother, and oops, now I screwed it up. somebody can help me. I just screwed it up. Oh, there we go. This is Grandma with a few of the kids and Grandpa. And picture brides are, there was the system where the men who had immigrated to the United States would send it was kind of like Tinder for the 1920s for Japanese. The men would send a picture, and like Tinder, it often was like some younger, more handsome guy, it wasn't them. And then the families would arrange a marriage. But my mother, I mean, look at Grandpa, he's a nice looking dude. So Grandma got the guy in the picture, so she was very happy. But they started having kids and had a family, and they raised in Los Angeles. And so they again lived under this ecosystem of systemic racism. Systemic racism is a real ecosystem. It's like there are laws, you know, immigration laws, Jim Crow laws were part of the ecosystem. Racial violence was a tool in that ecosystem. Cultural attitudes, you know, what you saw on, you know, the screen, the new technology of movies and cartoons, et cetera, that was a part of the ecosystem. And for Asian Americans, we were immediately perceived or caricatured as the other, as the perpetual foreigner. So I want to show you a clip from Asian Americans, the story of Connie Young Yu's family. And Connie is, I guess she's a 4th or 5th generation Asian American. Her great-grandfather first came to the United States in the 1860s to build the Transcontinental Railroad, to work on the railroad. Somehow he was able to marry a Chinese woman. I don't know if she was in this country or he brought her from China. But so his son, Connie's grandfather, was a US citizen because of birthright citizenship, which was, by the way, was really, the birthright citizenship was a kind of fight that was fought by African Americans, and then a Chinese American restaurant worker, you know, took his case to the Supreme Court. He was born here to prove that, you know, to guarantee that immigrants also would have birthright citizenship. The children of immigrants would have birthright citizenship no matter where their families were from and no matter what their immigrant status was. And of course, his Chinese immigrant parents at that time, you know, had no pathway to citizenship. They were considered illegals because they were because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So Connie's grandfather, you know, he's born here as a U.S. citizen. He became like a successful businessman in San Francisco's Chinatown. He had a family. He married a woman who was from China, and life was great. So oh, I'm supposed to show this clip. Okay. Okay.
It was an earthquake in the morning, and they were evacuated. And my grandfather realized there were some papers that he had to have. And he runs back and grabs a bunch of papers. He's coming out, and a soldier sees him and bayoneted him because they thought he was a looter. So my grandfather played dead and got up later when the soldier left and joined his family. What my grandfather thought was so important that he would risk his life for was his birth certificate and several letters of recommendation from white people that he was a legitimate American citizen. And that's what you needed at that time. That was worth your life. My grandfather, he would go back and forth to China, but every time he traveled, his papers were checked. He wanted his family with him, so he brought his family on one of the trips and had them staying in Shanghai. In September 1922, He was coming back and he died on board ship. My grandmother realized she had to go back to the United States, and these were American-born children, my mother and her 3 sisters. My mother said it was so exciting when they reached the Golden Gate. They could see the city and they were jumping up with joy. And then she said, and then to be stopped.
Angel Island Immigration Station, which opened in 1910, is the chief point of entry for immigrants from across Asia.
They had inspection at the dock. The children were released because they were American citizens, but my grandmother's papers, they officially said, this is Wang Shi, wife of Li Yuksui. The inspector said, you're a widow. Your husband is not with you. A widow has no status. And she was detained. She was taken to Angel Island and questioned. Angel Island has been called the Ellis Island of the West. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Ellis Island, with the Statue of Liberty, represents immigrants being welcome. Angel Island meant exclusion. It meant interrogation. It was a place to be feared. My grandmother was detained on Angel Island for 15 and a half months.
In 1977, Connie took her mother back to Angel Island for the first time in 50 years.
My mother would take the ferry with her sister to visit her mother. She would try to visit like twice a week. They could only talk like through a barrier for like 15 minutes. My grandmother told my mother, when you leave, when you go down the walkway to the boat, you'd look at the window of the barracks, and I'll be waving from the top floor. I'll be waving from the window. And so my mother would go down, and she'd see my grandmother's hand waving to her. One of the harshest punishments is to separate parents from their children. It's a detention of people who are struggling to survive.
Connie's grandmother spends over a year at Angel Island before she's finally able to reunite with her American-born children.
Of course, and that's why you see even more recently, Asian Americans have been very active and during the Muslim ban of 2017, protecting people's rights as immigrants. Asian Americans have been making pilgrimages to the southern border because of our own history and our own legacy of family separation and detention. So you can see during that time, this idea of the yellow peril for South Asians, the equivalent was they were considered the dusky peril or the tide of turbans, massing on the borders into the United States. And Asian Americans were seen as foreigners who could never assimilate, who could never be part of the we as Americans. Part of it was, in the, especially the early 1900s was the era of racial science and, this belief that there were biological racial differences. That's the time when, Asian Americans were really triangulated into the racial hierarchy with blacks and whites. So, this idea that in the racial hierarchy, whites were on the top, blacks were on the bottom, and with probably indigenous people, and then Asians occupied a space in between, and also Latinos you could probably argue would, depending on color, would occupy that same space. So in the 1870s, there was this saying in the California state legislature that there's this one legislator who said, you know, if you look at the biological worth, value of people of different races, and I'm sorry I'm going to use the words that he used, he said that it takes 2 Chinamen to equal the worth of 1 white man, but it takes 2 Negroes to equal the worth of 1 Chinaman. So you kind of see that how the model minority, the seeds of the model minority, really was established, was rooted as early as the 1870s. And so my grandparents were here for a half century almost, and all that time they could never become naturalized as US citizens because Asians were considered aliens ineligible for citizenship. So they had no legal pathway to citizenship until 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act. And the 1950s was really interesting because, you know, obviously the immigration policy started to open up, and for Asian Americans, like for Japanese Americans, just a few years ago, they were imprisoned as the enemy. You know, they were like the evil Japanese, and all of a sudden, they're the model minority. In the 1950s, everything changed. You see it in the press and all these articles and movies like Sayonara and Tea House of the August Moon. And so the context for that, and something we talk about in the series is, well, 2 things were going on. And again, it was very similar to today. I mean, there was a Cold War against capitalism, democracy against communism, and the civil rights movement. So in terms of the Cold War, the United States wanted to demonstrate that we are a democracy, and we're a democracy of racial equality. And how can we make that claim when people of color in this country, are enduring Jim Crow and exclusion? I mean, the Chinese Exclusion Act ended in the 1940s, but still there were exclusionary laws, and still people were treated as second-class citizens. So Asian Americans were really upheld to Asia, which was seen as a very important front for the fight against communism. Asian Americans were upheld as being this, proof that in America we do practice racial equality. You just work hard, and you'll be accepted. You'll be able to assimilate. In the domestic front, the civil rights movement was, really emerging during the 1950s and the 60s, and Asian Americans were used as a wedge against the legitimate fight for equality by Black Americans. So, the Asian Americans were used as this proof of, if you just shut up, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, keep quiet, don't make any demands, don't march, don't protest, then you'll be accepted in America. So both of these narratives of the perpetual foreigner and the model minority, they still exist to this day. I mean, they're all over the culture to this day. But then, if you, again, kind of rewind to the 1960s, it's a time when big changes happen. Big changes were about to happen. And so up to that time, Asian Americans were really kind of a stagnant population because of exclusion. People were still coming, but they were coming like most of the Chinese immigrants would come with false papers, as paper sons and paper daughters. They would come with false papers. But the population wasn't really growing. But then in 1965, the immigration reforms, and these immigration reforms also were partly a response to the Cold War and the kind of image the United States wanted to project versus communism, and also because of this push towards racial equality, the civil rights movement, and this kind of, moral pressure for justice, for racial justice and racial equality. And so the decades and decades of anti-racist, anti-Asian, exclusionary immigration policy was ended in the 1965 immigration reforms, which, by the way, sort of created this pool of so-called model minorities. So there were two preferences. One preference in the new 1965 immigration law was family reunification. The other was skilled workers. So you had all these people from Asia, Korea, Hong Kong, whatever, from Pakistan and India who came. They were already educated. Many came here to go to graduate school, or they already had skills and professions. It was a brain drain, creating this pool of highly skilled, highly educated immigrants. So while as an Asian, I'd like to say, oh yeah, we just have bigger brains and we're just smarter and harder working. But in fact, it was this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of many people who already were privileged and successful in their home countries. The other thing that happened in the 1970s, very soon after, was the war in Southeast Asia, the end of the war in Southeast Asia, and the arrival of almost 1 million Southeast Asian refugees to this country. And so you see in the 1960s and 70s with this change, the diverse America that we are existing in today, that we've seen really rise in the past couple of decades, or the past few decades. It's part of it is rooted in that time with Asian immigration and Asian refugees. And Asian Americans now, of course, are the fastest growing racial population in the country. And remember that in the 1970s, after the fall of Saigon and all these refugees began to come here, a lot of Americans didn't want them here. They didn't want them here. And so, but it created this whole new, not only population, but these new generations of Southeast Asians who either came here when they were very young or were born here, and who themselves have been reshaping the American narrative. So the next clip I'd like to show you from the series is a very short visit with Viet Thanh Nguyen, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist and writer. He won the Pulitzer for The Sympathizer. He's a really amazing thinker and writer. So.
I really don't remember much about Vietnam. My memory really begins coming here to the United States as a refugee arriving in Pennsylvania. My parents found an opportunity. They opened a Vietnamese grocery store in downtown San Jose on East Santa Clara Street, which is the heart of the city. My impression of San Jose is inseparable from the experiences of being a refugee. These refugees were suffering. They were trying to build a life for themselves here, and yet they were still traumatized by the war, or they were trying to forget the war. I remember when I was around 10 or 11 years old, walking down the street from my parents' store and seeing a sign in another store window that said, "Another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese." And I knew that this was directed at people like my parents. My parents worked 12 to 14-hour days in this store almost every day of the year. My parents were shot in that store on Christmas Eve. So, for me, that sign will stay with me because it was a sign that was a story that was targeted at my parents and everybody like us. And so I swore one day that I would have an opportunity to rewrite that sign, to write another story.
And so, again, Viet is part of this generation of Southeast Asians who are really not only telling their own story, but connecting with other stories and other movements for justice. Because a lot of Americans did not want Southeast Asian refugees here, but there are Americans who advocated for them. Americans of whites and blacks and Latinos, Americans of all colors. There were Catholic and Lutheran churches and all over the United States. I once filmed in Garden City, Kansas, which had been an all-white rural kind of community, and the meatpacking plants came in. They needed labor, but they welcomed refugees from Vietnam, refugees from Cambodia, from El Salvador, from Ethiopia. They welcomed refugees from all over, and the churches resettled a lot of the refugees. And there were conflicts. There's always conflicts, but then there was also this kind of welcome and solidarity. The Vietnamese artists like Viet and writers like Viet have also very recently, particularly during the Syrian refugee crisis, reclaimed the history of African Americans who really advocated for Southeast Asian refugees during the 1970s. I mean, if you know the story of Bayard Rustin, who was the legendary African American civil rights leader, one of the architects of the 1963 March on Washington, and Bayard Rustin with Elie Wiesel and Joan Baez and other Americans of different backgrounds were part of the International Rescue Committee, and Bayard Rustin toured Thai refugee camps and really felt very strongly that they should be welcomed into the United States, and he mobilized major black civil rights leaders. They took out a full-page ad in the New York Times, I think it was 1978, and they advocated for the United States to welcome these refugees, and drew the connection between their situation in the United States and colonialism in Asia. And going back even further to that era, I was talking about after the Civil War, around Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction, in 1969, actually one of the most powerful voices advocating for Chinese and Japanese immigrants was Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist leader. And Frederick Douglass in 1869 made this, really a powerful speech in urging the United States to welcome these immigrants. And this was in the midst of this Chinese must go, it's anti-Asian immigrant sentiment in this country. And he said, "The right of migration, the right which belongs to no particular race, but belongs alike to all and to all alike." And that was Frederick Douglass. And so this history is not only a history, again, of conflict and systemic, well, it is a history of systemic racism, but it is also the history of activism in solidarity and activism in resistance to that systemic racism. I know that there's this real stereotype of Asian Americans as being, the quiet minority, but if you look at the history, which is often not told, it tells another story. Again, around the time Frederick Douglass made that speech in 1867, that year, the biggest labor action in the United States was the strike by thousands of Chinese railroad workers for better conditions and for equal pay with the white workers. So Asian Americans have always fought back in the courts, at the ballot box, in the streets, on campuses, and in the culture. And that's what you see throughout this history. And that fight is a part of, pushing and forming this more perfect union. The fact that, you know, I was able to do the series, or here in the university, you have a new minor in Asian American Studies. Well, that is rooted in long fights. Congratulations. I hope you didn't have to take over an administration building to do it. But, you know, the strikes for ethnic studies, multiracial strikes for ethnic studies at places like San Francisco State, where I think the strike lasted almost a year. Those, I mean, they were bloody conflicts and, you know, really hard-won fights, and that's what got us ethnic studies, you know, which is now, hopefully, will continue to flourish. Let me check my time here. So I just wanted to wrap up by just saying, you know, again, as I started, you know, the past really helps us understand the current moment. In two examples, recent examples, one is the Atlanta murders. Now, the Atlanta murders, March 16th, 2021, actually a year to the day after President Trump's first tweet, Chinese virus, a year to the day, Aaron Long gunned down, he targeted 3 Asian businesses in the Atlanta area, gunned down 8 people, including 6 Asian women. And so when that happened, Asian Americans were really shattered, of course, as other Americans were. But in our gut, we knew it wasn't a coincidence. I mean, 3 Asian businesses, 6 Asian women. But the next morning after the shooting, the spokesman for the Cherokee County Sheriff had his press briefing, and he said, well, I talked to Aaron Long, the shooter, and he said it's nothing to do with race. And he had a very bad day, and he has a sex addiction. You know, all of that might be true, but Asian Americans call bullshit. I mean, you've really got to look at race. And one thing that people looked at is these fault lines that go back to our origin story, go back to our history. In 1875, even before the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Page Act, which was directed at Chinese women, was enacted. And the Page Act basically banned Chinese women from entering the country because they were seen as being prostitutes, as being carriers of disease, the other. I mean, carriers of disease, you know, sounds familiar. Even the American Medical Association at that time issued this warning that there were these diseases that the Chinese were immune from, but these women would infect white men and the white men would die. That was an AMA alert. So you can see like this perception of Asian women as hypersexual, as the bearers of disease, as the other, as expendable. How that has, you know, become a part of the DNA of American culture. I mean, particularly because in the 1900s, 4 US wars were all fought in Asia: the Philippines, the Pacific War, Korea, and Southeast Asia. And so that kind of encounter between the American military and Asian women in those places were really, you know, kind of really embedded this idea of Asian women as being like these sexual objects. And hate crimes, you know, often in a hate crime, you know who killed who, you know, wielded the gun or the knife or whatever, or the baseball bat in the case of Vincent Chin. But it's really looking inside the head of the perpetrator, like what were they thinking? How were they being influenced by, you know, personal lived experience or cultural images, et cetera. So people argued, well, you have got to look at, you know, race in this killing. And the second was after the George Floyd killing, when all Americans, not all Americans, but so many, millions of Americans of all backgrounds rose up in, you know, advocating for racial justice and advocating against police violence, particularly directed towards African Americans. And in that year, in that movement, many of these threads, I think, came together also for Asian Americans. Asian Americans, many were very involved and have been involved since, even before Ferguson. There are Asian American allied organizations that were fighting against, forms of police violence all over the United States. So I just wanted to close with another clip. This is not from the Asian American series. I call this, it's the May 19th project, which the writer Jeff Chang and I produced with a whole group of independent filmmakers. And I sort of call it the son of the Asian American series. It was a series of 14 short videos about this whole legacy of solidarity. And so this is Yua Vang Lee mourns George Floyd. And it's a short video by Steve Meng. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm waiting for somebody to start the video.
Mama!
Thằng cô bùa trâu pro đều quý họ nói như hà cô chỉ tao bang là bữa nà nó này thằng này cô sáng rồi cô tôi mình nhồi chị con thấy có cửa như ô cái mà sẽ thôi.
On July 22nd, 2006, Officer Jason Anderson shoots and kills 19-year-old Fong Lee, saying Fong had a gun.
Fong Lee was shot 3 times in the back and 5 times while he was on the ground. He was a child of refugees. He was also a student, and they were trying to label him as a gang member to discredit him.
Anybody look at the video knew that there was no gun there. They got away with murder, and they do it all the time in our community.
From the beginning, activists on the black community really supported the family.
The injustice that's been going on a long time, but if we all come together, Asian, white, black, Latino, if we say we're not going to take it no more, we can stop it.
Cậu cũng một cái trò nhẹ cũng như ba hả? Là những người lời ba của chị thầu cũng nói là như ba em đợi là giờ cái cũ bao giờ chị của một ba thế.
Miss Yua being in solidarity with the family of George Floyd, that was powerful.
So many Hmong go back and forth with like elders all the time of like, don't go protest, this isn't our issue, this is a black and white issue. And it's like validating to like hear her out there.
I still see the pain. She's not just advocating for Fong Lee no more. She's advocating for justice. She's an advocate for all.
Agent looks tired.
Okay.
Linh thì nó chỉ sáng tạo vậy. Từ tiệm mà bây giờ tàu ship ba mua cho cái nhân dân cho bây giờ đó ấy có mua cái chỗ xe cho bây mình tụi nó lại có bây nói.
So I didn't want to end with 2 very tragic and infuriating murders, but you can even see in those events and the aftermath just the beauty and the power of people telling their own story, shaping their own story, and that story becoming our story, and that our story becoming a vehicle for change, for real change. And that's really what I wanted to end with. So thank you very much, and get your QR codes or whatever out there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you so much for the talk, and for the audience, yeah, the signs with the QR codes to submit some questions, but we do have a few to start with.
Okay.
First of all, how can scholars promote the importance of historiography, especially in today's post-COVID, post-Trump society?
History, you mean just telling history?
Yeah.
I don't really have a degree, advanced degree, so I just make movies about history. How can scholars do? I mean, scholars can do it by being historians and also, fighting in the institutions and in schools for these histories to be told. I mean, you had to with your Asian American minor, I mean, that's a part of that struggle. It has to be taught somewhere. It has to be taught in classes. People have to do the research. People have to, you know, interpret that research and get it out there. So.
Another one, how did your previous work in documentaries inform the Asian American series?
Oh, it felt like my whole life led to the Asian American series. I mean, even like I was saying, going back to being in 6th grade in Mrs. Counts' class. Actually in high school, because when I was growing up, you know, they didn't teach anything about Asian Americans. So we were so hungry, you know, young Asian Americans were so hungry for our history. We actually used to organize little mini courses that we taught ourselves. I mean, we actually would study after school, which was kind of mind-blowing. But we would get like our older siblings or neighbors who were at UCLA or San Francisco State or Berkeley would give us their mimeographs. There was an old technology called mimeographs of, like, you know, Chinese railroad workers in the camps and like the race riots, you know, against Filipinos in 1930 in Central California. And we'd teach ourselves. And then we'd go on strike and demand, you know, that be taught in the classroom. And, you know, that never happened while I was in school.
Back to the documentary again. How did you find some of those stories that you used in the documentary? And did you find too many to use? How did you kind of select those?
We actually were going to make 6 hours, but we could never raise the money, so we had to stick with 5 hours. That's why there's a whole gap, you know, in the more current years. But yeah, it's, you know, it's really endless, the number of stories, because they haven't really been told. And also a lot of the images and a lot of footage and material, you know, we had to find from alternative sources because, you know, Asian Americans, like other people of color, were either not pictured by mainstream sources or they were like really, you know, if it was Latinos in the 60s, it was always like crime and gangs, for example. But you have people, you have kind of like these so-called amateur filmmakers in the community who are out shooting or photographing. You had people who were like shooting home movies. People in their family albums, they had material. So yeah, we just had to look far and wide.
We have another one. What can we do better to fight for immigration justice in the United States today?
Is that a real question?
It is, yes.
I mean, we all have to be a part of the fight, I think. And I think the one thing I learned in this May 19th project, the video I just showed you was part of that project. And it was a real response to two things. One is just generally, this was around the time, we started the project around the time of the Atlanta murders as kind of a rapid response to not only anti-Asian violence that had been growing, but also the way that these viral videos were being pushed out in the press and social media that pictured mostly black and brown assailants attacking Asian Americans. If you look at the studies, the anti-Asian hate has been, the vast majority has been perpetrated by whites. But these viral videos were going out and, you know, they were like feeding into, it was like the meaning of two stereotypes. The stereotype of black and brown criminality and the stereotype of the model minority Asian. And, you know, it was just like a narrative. It was a story that was very seductive. And so we wanted to respond to that by looking at, you know, this alternate story of solidarity. I have a feeling I've really gone off tangent, but so I'll end it there from the original question.
Yeah, we have a few more coming in. What advice do you have for the youth when pursuing a higher degree of education, and what inspired you to stay motivated?
Well, I actually didn't get anything beyond a BA, so I wasn't very, although in my day, you know, people just didn't go to film school like they, you know, do now. Like there are very few students of color in film graduate programs. But I mean, you know, that's really hard to say. It's, you know, I used to say to, especially if it's not, I know you're talking about just generally higher education, but particularly for young filmmakers, I used to say to them, you really have to follow your passion regardless of what your parents say, you only have one life, etc. But I do realize that, you know, as opposed to when I graduated from school, you know, the students graduate, they have incredible debt. They might be first-gen students. They have to like send money home to their families. They have to help their families out. So higher education, you know, sometimes it's like a pragmatic kind of thing. You stay in school, your earnings potential goes up. You can really, you know, help your family get yourself out of debt. But sometimes it's not, you know, what do you really want to do with your life? So in that case, you know, I think it's tough, and I think for somebody like me, who's my age, grew up middle class, you know, I would have a hard time being justified to give anybody advice if they were in that position. So I know you're talking about in general, but, you know, specifically those students who, you know, a lot of us try to mentor within the university.
Okay, we have a couple that are similar that I think would be sort of a nice closing thought for you, and I'll read both of them and you can respond as you like. But will you make any more documentaries like Asians Americans? And the other question is, what is next for you? What stories do you hope to tell in your next projects?
Oh, I'm going to do something fun I can't talk about because we haven't like done all the contracts yet, but it's going to be fun. And it's going to be about an actor that you will all recognize, and it's like he has an amazing story. And I'm actually, you know, interested in expanding on the May 19th project and really looking at the Black and Asian relations over the years. You know, both like, you know, taking a hard look at conflicts, yes, but also looking at solidarity and looking at, you know, it's like a story and that has really been, you know, people maybe have taken up the story since the 1960s, but I think it goes back, you know, almost a couple hundred years at this point. So that's one thing, you know, I'm thinking of like Ava DuVernay's 13th, the way she kind of, you know, dealt with, you know, the ideas. And she made a film really about ideas and history in many ways, just, you know, getting like these real amazing speakers and thinkers. I'm kind of playing around with that possibility.
We got one more. This may be another good one to wrap up on, and we'll let you go after this. But what is the role of emotion in the work that you do, both in generating them, diffusing them, organizing what their purpose is in political action? What's the most important lesson for Asian Americans in forging solidarity with other communities?
Yeah, I don't see my work as being any different from, you know, any other filmmaker. Make them laugh and cry. I mean, that's, you know, I think that filmmaking, documentary is always seen as being kind of educational, informational, but, you know, it's moved into the realm of entertainment. But I think within that space, you know, there's a possibility for the documentary because you have the power of emotion and personal storytelling to really reach people in a powerful way so that they will go out and do the reading, they'll want to do the study, you know, they'll want to do the research, they'll want to get involved in these social movements. So, but I think, you know, the one thing we do best is to, you know, character, plot, story, conflict, emotion. I mean, that's, I think, what we do. I think that's our role.
Well, great. I think that's a wonderful point to end on, and thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks.
I hope everybody enjoyed the talk this evening. We hope to see you at more of our events. The next one will be held tomorrow, next Humanities Festival event, Transformation, Story, Character, and Meaning Across Time and Space. And this will be at the University of Arizona Poetry Center in the Rubel Room. As you leave, if you want to, you can pick up a calendar. I think they're over there, aren't they, TJ? Yeah. So you can pick up a calendar for more of the upcoming festival events. And again, thank you, Renee, and thanks to everyone for coming.